In this news roundup for the week on the 15th of April 2022, President Biden caused another stir by labelling Russia's war in Ukraine as genocide. Boris Johnson survived a week where he went from glory to disgrace to controversy. Elon Musk offered to buy Twitter, and the French election gets to the pointy end. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. The US President Joe Biden made a few headlines this week when he accused Russia of committing acts of genocide in Ukraine. Now, genocide is a big word with some pretty important consequences, not to be used lightly. It's not meant to be simply a big superlative that you reach for when people have engaged in terrible atrocities, which of course is unquestionably the case in Ukraine, as has been all too evident day by day this week. It is the intentional destruction of a people, an ethnic, national, racial or religious group. Biden justified it by referencing statements suggesting that Putin is trying to wipe out the idea of a Ukrainian identity. Now it matters, because there's a stronger expectation of intervention on the part of the international community in order to prevent a genocide. One reason why the US has traditionally been reluctant to use the term. When his press secretary Jen Psaki was pressed on whether he'd misspoken on this, bearing in mind how quickly they rode back on certain other off-the-cuff comments that he made, she said this: "He is the President of the United States and the leader of the free world, and he is allowed to make his views known at any point he would like." Which rather sounds like they think he did misspeak, but they found him unwilling to accept the point, so they've kind of had to roll with it as him expressing an opinion rather than making a statement of settled US policy. Which is the sort of thing you recall was supposed to have ended when Donald Trump left office. Anyway, the Kremlin responded with fury, saying that Biden was trying to distort the situation and that this wasn't acceptable from the US, which after all had committed well-known crimes in recent times. Some of the American media also leapt in to scold the president. AP News, for instance, suggested that there was no such thing as a purely personal opinion from the Oval Office on policies that matter. It accused him of sowing confusion in dangerous times, and the Washington Post and Bloomberg News had similar comments. Not that going the other way was any guarantee of success either. So the French President Macron waded in by saying that he would advise being careful with such terms today because these two peoples are brothers, he said. Which immediately also got a savage backlash from critics, observing how much this mirrored the language of Putin himself, and that Russians had probably bombed their way out of the brotherhood by now. This is one of those odd positions where you're pressured to use the most extreme language or else be accused of downplaying the seriousness of what's happening. Really though, it's reflective of one more example of how the current world order has kind of failed. The world attempted to define crimes against humanity so egregious that their evil would be agreed as being beyond dispute. But perpetrators simply show that nothing is beyond dispute, and then the world ducks the implications of its own rules because it's fearful of the consequences of acting on them. A messy reality probably best expressed by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who managed a formula that successfully avoided the bear pit on either side. He said that the events, particularly in Bucha, doesn't look far short of genocide. Indeed, the UK Prime Minister has been having a busy week this week. It started with a remarkable weekend where he travelled to Kiev, met with President Zelensky, and then, supported by some very nervous-looking armed guards, went on a short walkabout around the city with Zelensky. Now, this was genuinely courageous. Of course, the main action had moved elsewhere, but trains are still occasionally being hit by fire, and there are still thought to be agents, maybe snipers in Kiev, who could suddenly get lucky to find the British Prime Minister walking in their vicinity. And indeed, Kiev was hit today, with explosions in revenge for Ukraine's successful sinking of the battleship, the Moskva. So, not to be understated. And a lot of people who have done little but criticise Johnson in recent months found themselves applauding and saying things like, in spite of all the recent missteps, here at last was a moment when they could feel genuinely proud of their country and the stand it was taking. Well, that didn't last too long, obviously, because as soon as the Prime Minister got home, he got handed the first of a possible string of fines for having attended events at number 10 Downing Street that were considered to have been parties, which were against the lockdown rules that he had brought in at that time. And the news media, who simply can't help themselves when they get presented with a possible moment where they could have a feeding frenzy that might bring down a major political figure, they duly dived all over it. And the conditions were there that could potentially have toppled him. Monday's was just the first fine. More are going to follow, we expect. And each one of those would be an excuse to ratchet up the pressure. Late on Monday, a First Minister resigned. A junior minister for sure, one based in the House of Lords, not a big name, but this could simply be the next step in ratcheting up the pressure. You get this cascading effects. We've seen the script before. We know how it goes. Now, even at the start, it wasn't obvious that it was necessarily going to run that natural course. The war in Ukraine had drained a lot of the willingness to depose Boris Johnson within his own party. MPs that had previously added letters to the pile calling for a no-confidence vote, at least some of them had publicly retracted those letters since the war began. And he'd just come back from Kiev. Very few seem to have the stomach to then immediately leap back onto the attack because, of a few parties that happened now 2 years ago. And then, thanks to some fortuitous timing, the government successfully pushed the story off the top headlines by announcing that the illegal migrants that make it to the country across the English Channel from France, some of them at least, the single males predominantly, would be shipped off to Rwanda to start a new life there instead. That sort of dramatic policy announcement was always going to take headlines, but particularly because the media and the left would feel genuine shock and outrage at what they would feel to be outright racism underpinning that policy. Again, they can't help themselves. Even though doing so cut across their own feeding frenzy project of just 5 minutes ago, and even though some of them at least must realise that this is exactly the sort of Dominic Cummings style move that feeds off their outrage. Because we know that the Brexit voters, the so-called Red Wall voters who voted Conservatives for the first time to get Johnson to be able to get Brexit done, those people wanted to see Britain taking back control of its borders. And they'd seen precious little success on that score to date. The UK tried to persuade France to let it support them in stopping people getting to the UK in the first place, but President Macron not all that inclined to give a supporting hand to anything that seems to back up Brexit, so they refused. Now, by outraging the established media and the opposition parties in this way, they have guaranteed there will be major coverage. There will be many politicians and others talking very loudly about how terrible and unfair and inhuman the government is being in sending these people to Africa. And that will likely communicate to those Red Wall voters that, at last, something effective is being done. You only have to see how the Remainers are howling about it. None of that actually depends on it being effective, or indeed a humane policy. It just works on a suitably subliminal level, in the same way that the Brexit campaign buses about how much would be saved for the NHS? £350 million, where the outraged opposition promoted far and wide how that number was not accurate, and in so doing reinforced in people's minds that voting Brexit would save lots of money for the NHS, which was more important to them than what the exact figure was. This potentially works in the same way. probably going to be largely invisible in the polls based on recent experience. We will only know what impact it had, if any, come the local elections, which are due soon. And also it turns out a coming by-election that will be held in one of the red wall seats, that of Wakefield, after the Conservative MP there was accused of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old and has subsequently resigned. Because of so-called Partygate, the Tories were expected to get a pounding in the upcoming election. Almost certainly this doesn't cancel that, but will it make any difference in reducing it? Right now it's hard to know. People are still pretty fed up with Boris Johnson. The Partygate thing certainly hasn't gone away yet, since more fines are due to come. There's the Sue Gray report, the civil servant who investigated all the events of what happened. The final version of that is still due to be delivered. But one thing it certainly did was to make sure that everyone was talking about what the government was doing now, rather than how many glasses of Chardonnay were quaffed back in 2020. Some of them are talking about it on Twitter, of course. Everyone else on Twitter seems mostly to be talking about the fact that Elon Musk had set feathers flying by making a bid to buy the platform. We will come to that in just a minute. But first, no deep dive video is Monday on account of it being Easter. But I will aim to do something topical for Monday. On Wednesday, it's time for a Q&A video. I'll be taking questions from Patreon supporters by preference, since they make this channel possible, but other interesting and topical questions are also welcome. If you'd like to add one, please post in the comments section, starting with the word question in all caps, so it's easy for me to spot when I'm scrolling through. And then join me for that, going live at 7 PM UK time next Wednesday. See you there. So yes, Elon Musk put in his bid to buy Twitter. This came after a rather rapid escalation of some shadow boxing that began when it became known that he'd built up a stake in the company that made him its largest shareholder. They tried to bring him onto the board, an arrangement that would have carried with it an agreement not to go beyond a certain percentage of stock, not to definitely launch a hostile bid for the company, and preferably not to randomly tweet about things that might actively harm the company. But random tweeting is what Elon likes to do, and he quickly started asking a range of questions, pondering, for instance, whether the fact that some of the most followed users didn't tweet anymore meant the platform was dying. But mostly he got vocal about his concern about free speech, and whether a company like this shouldn't be required to guarantee it as a de facto provider of an important public space. So ultimately he turned down the place on the board and he duly launched a full-out assault. Now, how serious a bid is it really? Musk is big on capturing attention, and it's just as likely he's seeking to stir things up with a move rather than genuinely wanting to put all the time into making Twitter his next big project. It's not as though he doesn't have enough current projects, you would think. Can he afford the $43 billion he offered for it? Well, on paper, sure. He's the world's richest man, on paper. But a lot of that theoretical wealth is bound up in Tesla stock, and it's not clear whether he could really organise it, as he tacitly admitted when he said, "I'm not sure that I will actually be able to acquire it." Theoretically, he could borrow against his shares, but only up to a certain amount, and it's thought, but not confirmed, that he's already borrowed in the region of $20 billion. That may or may not be true, but the point is it's not going to be as cut and dried as many people imagine. At the time of shooting this video, the board of Twitter were considering the offer, as they're obliged to do on behalf of their shareholders. My bet, going to be quickly proven or disproven this one, is that they will reject the offer. And Musk had been clear that it was a final offer, so presuming he holds to that, that will be that. But even if that's all that happens, it's given him a platform to push a lot harder on the message that he delivered during an interview this week. A good sign as to whether there is free speech is if someone you don't like is allowed to say something you don't like. Since free speech, a principle that used to be valued by all sides in political discourse, seems now to have become party polarised in the US like everything else, this was uniquely celebrated on the Republican side and kind of treated like the second coming of Adolf Hitler on the left of the Democrat side. For Republicans, of course, the question immediately came into focus whether a Musk takeover would see the return to the platform of former President Trump. Trump had said that he wouldn't rejoin Twitter, but given the slow-motion car crash that Truth Social has turned into, and if it was under the cover of a takeover of this sort, it does seem highly likely that he would be tempted. The key argument Musk was making, that freedom of speech would be easier to defend on Twitter if it was a private company rather than a publicly held one, is an interesting and by no means intuitive one. It's the benevolent dictator theory. A private company doesn't have to bow to political pressure because it can be led by someone who has strong values. And it's true, but it suffers from the inbuilt flaw that all benevolent dictator attempts suffer from, which is that power corrupts and benevolence can be in the eye of the beholder. Elon Musk has done a number of hugely impressive, constructive things through his businesses, and he's also made a number of really dumb mistakes. Most of those mistakes were made via the medium of Twitter, including falsely labelling someone who criticised him as a paedophile. So while that can be part of the flawed but useful rating that Musk carries and goes towards making someone charismatic and interesting in many ways, is it the exact best fit with something as important as guaranteeing a public space? The answer is maybe. But the principle should really be upheld with some sort of democratic oversight rather than relying on the character of a single wealthy individual. Now, critics will say that's all very well, but when the institutions themselves become incapable of supporting free speech, which one of them are you going to put in charge of that oversight? Unfortunately, that is likely a fair question, and just another reflection of the rather deep hole that America has sunk into. In the meantime, Twitter users on the left have been working themselves into a frenzy and saying that they will leave the platform and go somewhere else should Musk be successful. The activists of the right can tell them that's a highly overrated option, given how little they've reportedly been enjoying being in the genuine echo chambers of their free speech defending alternatives, where they get to speak exclusively to themselves. Maybe if Trump comes to Twitter, they should all go to Truth Social, a place where to date Trump himself has made exactly one contribution. In so doing, perhaps they'll help turn it around, because right now it seems condemned to confirm my earlier prediction of its abject failure. That was an easy prediction, as indeed was the one last week about the final lineup for the French presidential election. Because yes, as expected, the first round of the French election gave us that runoff between President Macron and Marine Le Pen. Traditionally, this is where the French shrug their shoulders, hold their noses and vote for someone they don't much like in order to keep the other one out. But whatever else might happen, this time is promising to be a lot closer than what happened in the past. I talked about modern disillusionment in my recent video about why people are feeling lost. If you want a perfect illustration of that, you should reflect on the fact that a significant percentage of young people who voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the first round, who's the candidate described as far left, are expected to switch to vote for Marine Le Pen, the candidate described as far right. At least part of the vote in this election is less to do with the voters' understanding of or support for left-wing or right-wing positions and more to do with that reaction against the mainstream. And since in a number of areas the practice of the mainstream media of attaching a far label, usually to right-wing politicians, far right, in order to smear them, that is potentially backfiring, as the repetition has simply served to devalue the currency. And you can see that as well in France by the fact that the former two establishment parties, the centre-left socialists and the centre-right Republicans, who used to just run the show, They were trashed in this election, both polling below the threshold where their election expenses are reimbursed. Now, it's not as straightforward as that makes it sound. Last year, the regional elections saw the old mainstream parties doing really rather well, and Macron and Le Pen's parties doing incredibly badly, a result that commentators at the time suggested that received wisdom from Macron-Le Pen presidential election again was just plain wrong. Well, that didn't age well, so clearly different dynamics apply to the top job. Still, you would expect that so long as Macron now sharpens up his act, does some highly professional campaigning, and exposes Le Pen's extremist positions along the way, he'll scrape in. Right? Well, maybe, but in the first part of the campaign, that's not quite how you would describe what's been happening. Macron has found himself getting plenty of pushback from some of the citizens he's been meeting during his campaign visits. When he went, for instance, to the northern town of Denain, one of the poorest places in France, where 41% voted Le Pen in the first round, he was heckled by various locals. He seemed flustered when he was criticised over his COVID-19 policies, and attacks on pension reforms apparently provoked him to backtrack on his position on the fly. Another woman objected to school closures during lockdown, and he told her she didn't live in the real world, which might not have been the best choice of words when you're doing election campaigning. People will be laughing in front of their TV sets, she predicted. They might also be laughing about Macron's boast about how he has led France to do the most to support Ukraine in the current conflict. This coming at a time when Ukrainians on Twitter are using the phrase Macronism to mean to promise results again and again and not deliver. He has, at the start of the runoff campaigning, gone after his opponent, suggesting that although she'd changed her policy in public, privately she still intended to bring about Frexit. Frexit! Honestly, can't we do better than these stupid words? So yes, Marine Le Pen is not a fan of the EU. But now she says she wants to kick back against it and reform it from within, rather than to actually leave. A promise that will be familiar to many a British Prime Minister before the 2016 referendum. Macron is convinced that although the French moan about Brussels plenty, ultimately they will agree with him that the EU is in fact wonderful, and they want him to play a positive part in making it even more so. That is an optimistic position, for sure. For something you're going to put front and centre of your campaign. I mean, literally, he described the election as a referendum on the EU. Brave and inspired, astonishingly stupid, not long now before we find out. Let's talk briefly about Ukrainian President Zelensky, because it's fashionable amongst some, including some, not huge numbers, but some in the comment section on this channel, to dump on Zelensky. And sure, when someone's suddenly massively in favour, getting in early with a view that they're probably a flawed human being in advance of the inevitable disillusionment to come, it's a sure bet. Because everyone's flawed. So if they get put onto an unrealistically high pedestal, pretty obvious how it's going to go long term. But it misses the point. Winston Churchill was a flawed human. Before the war, his flaws were highly visible to his peers. Circumstance gave him the opportunity to be the leader that was needed at the time of greatest trial, and he rose to it. The country might well have been lost had he not. And that is something that many have held to be a more important service than being a flawless human would ever have been. When the challenge is great, you need people who can show leadership. Historically, some of the best ones were far from being nice people or well-liked before the event, certainly far from perfect by the standards of their own time, never mind the standards of ours. But they had the qualities that were needed, and that's the situation you pray for. So don't underestimate the importance of leadership. And don't discount as well the redemptive power of rising to a crisis on behalf of your community as something that can justly be weighed against whatever flaws you might have had, whatever mistakes you might have made. We live in a time of largely enfeebled leadership. Let's not pretend that doesn't have consequences. It's not surprising that Zelensky stood out from the moment he spurned the offer of a lifeline to safety from his feeble peers who projected their fear onto his situation. That someone should say, no, I don't care that the Russians are targeting Kiev, that they've imported mercenaries with a specific duty to take me out. This is the place a leader should be, and let the chips fall where they may. Across the world, people have responded to that because it's real leadership. And even if you hate the person doing it, you should give credit when you see it. The brutal truth of history is that it's probably only going to last for as long as the crisis lasts. Maybe a bit longer, depending. Churchill won the war, was appreciated by the nation for doing so, and then booted out of the next election because his flawed persona didn't fit the peace that people now wanted to build. If Zelensky survives the war and Ukraine survives as an independent nation, I dare say the same will eventually come to pass, even if it's not quite so quick. In the meantime, there are precious few people standing against a pretty destructive and inhumane force in the world. Whatever the cynicism we've trained ourselves into, it would be good to show it some respect and hope that the contrast might help us to sort our own ideas out. You know, in a week where President Biden made headlines for shaking hands with thin air after a speech, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson likewise for failing to follow his own rules and then blatantly lying about it. We could do with a catalyst that might help us to raise our own standards for what counts as leadership. All right. Many thanks to all of you who have given feedback on Wednesday's slightly experimental video, which was overwhelmingly positive, so thank you. It's a sort of video that won't get the highest number of views, but a channel like this isn't just about chasing the numbers. And if you find it to be of value to you, I will try to work out how to provide it. And I am able to experiment without worrying too much about the numbers, of course, because of the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without them, I wouldn't be able to put in the time that I do to produce 3 videos per week, nor to focus on the most important issues of the day, regardless of what YouTube might think about what I have to say about them. Seriously, I cannot overstress the importance of that group of fabulous people to this channel. If you would like to join them in supporting the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Either way, have a great Easter weekend and have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.